Hank Lawson had always believed in minding his own business. After serving 30 years in the military and spending another decade working in ranch management, all he wanted was a quiet retirement on a few acres of land where he could raise a handful of cattle, some chickens, and enjoy his days without the headaches of city life. He found the perfect property on the outskirts of a town that was still rural enough to have a strong farming community, but close enough to modern conveniences. It was a dream come true. That is, until he met Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the Maple Creek HOA. The trouble started small. At first, it was little things. Karen would leave HOA newsletters tucked under his gate, reminding him of community policies about aesthetic consistency. Hank barely paid attention. His property was clearly zoned for agricultural use, and even though some of the neighborhood had turned into more suburban-style developments, his land was grandfathered in. He had legal rights to maintain and expand his fencing if necessary. Then the coyotes came. Hank had seen signs of them for weeks. Tracks in the dirt, scattered feathers near the tree line, uneasy livestock. He had dealt with predators before, and he knew that if he didn't reinforce his fencing soon, he was going to start losing animals. So one morning, he set out to expand his perimeter fence, adding another 100 feet to his eastern boundary and reinforcing the weak points with stronger wire mesh. It wasn't anything drastic, just good, solid farm management. But apparently, Karen thought otherwise. The moment the first fence post was driven into the ground, she appeared like a storm rolling in from the horizon. Hank was tightening the wire on a post when he heard the familiar, grating voice. "Excuse me. Excuse me." He looked up to see Karen marching across the road, clipboard clutched in her hands, her expression a mix of self-righteous fury and exaggerated concern. Hank sighed. He wiped the sweat from his brow, set his tools down, and turned to face her. "Morning, Karen," he said, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. Karen didn't return the greeting. Instead, she planted herself right in front of the fence, eyes scanning the newly installed posts like they were some kind of crime scene. "What is this?" she demanded, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger toward the fence. Hank adjusted his hat. "Looks like a fence to me." Karen's nostrils flared. "You can't just put up fencing like this. This is a planned community. We have rules." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure my property isn't part of your planned community." Karen sputtered. "All land within Maple Creek is subject to the HOA's guidelines." Hank leaned against a fence post, crossing his arms. "That's so." Karen pulled out a folded document, flipping through it furiously. Section 14, subsection C, all perimeter modifications must be approved by the HOA board and must not disrupt the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. Hank couldn't help it. He laughed. Karen's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "What's so funny?" she snapped. "You're quoting HOA rules," Hank said, shaking his head. "Problem is, Karen, my land isn't HOA controlled. It's zoned agricultural. Always has been. Always will be." Karen's smug expression faltered. That can't be right," she muttered, flipping through her documents again. Hank leaned forward slightly. "Check your papers. I bought this land with full rights to maintain, modify, and expand my fencing as needed. I don't need your approval, and I sure as hell don't need your permission." Karen's hand clenched around her clipboard. She was losing ground, and she knew it. This is still a community matter," she blurted out. "People don't want to see barbed wire and farm fencing. It ruins the aesthetic." Hank's patience was wearing thin. "You know what ruins an aesthetic, Karen?" He pointed toward the tree line in the distance. "Coyotes ripping apart livestock. Predators coming in at night because people like you think a white picket fence is enough to keep them out." Karen sniffed. "Maybe if you weren't raising livestock like this was some kind of a backwater farm." Hank's eyes darkened. "Careful, Karen," he warned. "You're standing on my land, insulting the way I run it." For a split second, Karen hesitated. Then she did what all bullies do when they realize they're losing. She doubled down. "I'm issuing you a formal HOA violation notice," she declared, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. "You'll be receiving a fine, and if this fencing isn't taken down, we'll escalate to legal action." Hank let out a low whistle. "Well now," he said, rubbing his chin. "That sure sounds official." Karen thrust the paper toward him. Hank took it, glanced at it, then ripped it in half. Karen gasped. You can't just." "Yes, I can," Hank said, tossing the shredded paper into the dirt. Because you don't have jurisdiction here. Karen's face twisted with rage. This isn't over, she snapped. The HOA has lawyers. We'll see what the county has to say about this. Hank smiled. I'd love to see that, he said. Because last I checked, the county is real fond of farmers who protect their land. Karen turned on her heel, storming back toward her SUV. Jack watched her go, shaking his head. She wasn't going to let this go. People like Karen never did. And Hank? He wasn't backing down either. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. Hank Lawson had dealt with stubborn people before. He had negotiated with higher-ups in the military, wrangled wild cattle in the dead of night, and even talked a furious grizzly away from his camp once. But none of that had prepared him for the sheer, unrelenting pettiness of Karen Whitmore. The very next morning, Hank woke up to a fresh stack of violation notices tacked onto his fence post, each one more ridiculous than the last. Unauthorized structure placement, obstruction of community sightlines, excessive rural modifications. Hank let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck as he read through them. Excessive rural modifications, he muttered, shaking his head. Karen, you're really reaching now. But the real kicker. At the very bottom of the last notice, written in bright red ink, was a formal warning. Failure to comply will result in HOA legal action, including daily fines up to $500. Hank chuckled. A low, rumbling sound. It wasn't amused. It was the kind of chuckle a man gave when he was about to have some fun ruining someone's entire plan. Because Karen had just made a fatal mistake. She had put in writing that the HOA was planning to fine him for a structure that was legally protected under state agricultural laws. That meant she had zero legal ground to stand on. And Hank wasn't about to let this slide. He spent the morning making phone calls, pulling up property records, and doing his homework. The results were better than he expected. Not only was his land exempt from HOA control, but there was a clear section in county zoning laws that explicitly protected agricultural expansions for the purpose of livestock protection. Which meant Karen had no power here, and Hank was about to prove it. By noon, he had driven into town, stopped by the county records office, and walked out with a folder full of official documentation. Then he went one step further. He made one last phone call to a friend who happened to be a state agricultural inspector. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Hank wasn't just reinforcing his fence. He was expanding it even more. If Karen wanted a reason to complain, he was going to give her one. The next morning, right on schedule, her white SUV came speeding down the road, tires kicking up dust as she screeched to a stop in front of his property. Hank was already outside, leaning against the fence post, waiting. Karen practically flew out of the car, marching toward him with her clipboard clutched like a weapon. What is this? She screeched. Hank tipped his hat back. Morning, Karen. She stabbed a finger at the new fence posts. You're expanding it. Sure am, Hank said. Gotta make sure my livestock are safe. Karen's face turned bright red. I gave you a final warning. Hank raised an eyebrow. Did you? Karen pulled out a fat stack of violation notices, waving them like they were court summons. You are in clear violation of HOA guidelines, she barked. This structure is not approved. I'm issuing a $500 fine per day until this fence is removed. Hank slowly pulled out his own folder. Funny you mention fines, he said, flipping through the documents. Because I went ahead and checked with the county zoning office. And according to them, he handed her the first sheet. I have full rights to maintain and expand agricultural fencing as needed. Karen snatched the paper, eyes darting across the text. Her smirk wavered. Hank handed her the second document. This one, he continued, is a copy of my property's zoning classification. Clearly states I'm designated agricultural. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. And finally, Hank handed her the last document. And this, he said, unable to hide his smirk, is a formal warning from the State Agricultural Board. Seems someone tried to report me for unauthorized livestock barriers, but turns out, when you waste a state agency's time. Hank leaned in slightly. They don't like that. Karen's eyes widened. See, Hank said, crossing his arms, it turns out you've been issuing unlawful fines against a property that isn't even under HOA jurisdiction. And when I explained that to the state board, Hank smiled. They weren't happy. Karen visibly gulped. This is a misunderstanding, she stammered. I was only enforcing community standards. No, Karen, Hank cut her off. You were overstepping your legal authority. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. And if you think I'm the kind of man to let that slide, he let the words hang in there. Karen took a step back, then another. She started. Hank raised a hand. Now, before you start rambling, let me tell you what's going to happen next. Karen's mouth snapped shut. 1, you're going to drop those fines. Hank gestured toward her clipboard. Every single one. Karen shook her head. I can't just. Hank pulled out his phone. You sure about that? He asked, tapping the screen. Because I have the county zoning commissioner on speed dial. You want to explain to her why you're illegally fining an agricultural property? Karen froze. She looked at Hank, looked at the documents, then back at his phone. For the first time since this whole mess started, she didn't have a response. Hank smiled. That's what I thought. Karen's hand trembled as she flipped through her clipboard. She ripped the violation notices off one by one, muttering curses under her breath. Hank watched with satisfaction as she tore through every single fine. When she was done, she looked up, face burning with humiliation. This isn't over, she muttered. Hank tipped his hat. Oh, I think it is. Karen turned on her heel, storming back toward her SUV. Jack watched her go, shaking his head. She had just lost this battle. But Hank had a feeling. She wasn't done fighting this war. And that was her next mistake. Hank had expected Karen to back off after getting publicly humiliated, but people like her never knew when to quit. She had made it clear this wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was personal. For the next week, Hank noticed little things. His mail was being delivered late, if it showed up at all. The garbage pickup suddenly skipped his house while collecting from the rest of the neighborhood. His name mysteriously disappeared from the HOA's community bulletin, despite him still paying taxes for local upkeep. And then came the anonymous complaints. The first one claimed Hank's property was an eyesore, that his fence was lowering property values for the entire neighborhood. The second one accused him of creating an unsafe environment by having farm equipment too close to public roads. The third? That was the one that made Hank laugh out loud. According to the report, he was running an unlicensed commercial livestock operation. Hank leaned against his truck, reading the complaint with amusement. Karen, he muttered, shaking his head. You are too predictable. The final straw came when he caught her on his land. It was just past dusk, and Hank had just finished checking on the cattle when he saw it, a shadow moving along his fence line. At first, he thought it was a coyote, but then he noticed the jerky, nervous movements, the way the figure kept stopping to examine the fence posts. Karen. Hank didn't rush. He walked slowly, deliberately, making sure she saw him before he said a word. You lost, Karen. She spun around so fast she nearly tripped over herself. Hank let the silence hang, watching as she clutched a measuring tape in one hand and her ever-present clipboard in the other. This isn't what it looks like, she blurted. Hank smirked. Really? Because it sure looks like you're trespassing. Karen's jaw clenched. I was just inspecting the fence, she snapped. It's still violating HOA guidelines. Hank stepped closer. Karen, I don't give a damn about your HOA guidelines. But the law? The law says you're on my property without permission. Karen's smug expression cracked. You can't prove that. Hank slowly raised his phone and flipped the screen toward her. The live security feed showed her clear as day, walking along the fence line, taking measurements, stepping past his property markers. Karen's face drained of color. Oh, Hank said, enjoying this. I can prove it. She staggered back. You set me up. Hank chuckled. Karen, you set yourself up. Karen's eyes darted toward her SUV, parked down the road. She looked like she was about to bolt. Hank wasn't about to let her get away that easy. So here's what's going to happen, he said, keeping his voice calm, steady. I'm going to call the sheriff's office. And you're going to explain why you were creeping around my property at night. Karen went rigid. You wouldn't. Hank took out his phone, held up the screen so she could see it. Oh, I would. He tapped the contact for the sheriff's department. Karen snapped. You have no right. She shrieked. This land should have never been zoned agricultural. I should be able to control it. You should have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Hank stared at her, and suddenly everything clicked. This wasn't about his fence. It wasn't about property values. It wasn't even about rules. Karen couldn't stand the fact that she couldn't control him. She had spent years bossing people around, getting her way, making the neighborhood bend to her vision. And Hank was the first person who told her no. That's why she was losing her damn mind. Hank exhaled. Karen, you might want to get yourself a hobby. Karen's hands balled into fists. You don't belong here. Hank raised an eyebrow. And you do. Karen opened her mouth, then stopped. Because suddenly, the distant sound of gravel crunching under tires reached them. Headlights flooded the fence line. Karen spun around, eyes wide. And Hank just smirked. Because pulling up was the sheriff. Karen's panic hit instantly. You called him already? Hank crossed his arms. Nope. But I guess someone else did. Karen's face twisted. The sheriff's truck rolled to a stop, and out stepped Deputy Miller, a man Hank knew well. Miller took one look at the scene, then at Hank. Evening, Hank, he said. Hank nodded. Evening, Deputy. Miller's gaze landed on Karen, who was now sweating bullets. And you must be Karen Whitmore. Karen stiffened. Mrs. Whitmore, we received a trespassing report. Mind explaining what you're doing out here? Karen swallowed hard. I was just ensuring compliance. Miller sighed. Ma'am, this property is legally exempt from HOA oversight. You've been warned about that. Karen opened and closed her mouth. And yet, Miller continued, you still showed up here uninvited at night. That's not a good look. Hank watched satisfied as Karen began unraveling right in front of him. Miller glanced at Hank. You want to press charges? Karen visibly flinched. Hank thought about it. Oh, it would be real easy to have her arrested. But he wasn't done having fun yet. Nah, Hank said. Not yet. Miller nodded. Then I strongly suggest, Mrs. Whitmore, that you leave this man alone. Karen's nostrils flared, but she didn't say a word. She turned, stomped toward her SUV, and sped off like a bat out of hell. Miller let out a breath. She's gonna blow a gasket over this one. Hank grinned. Oh, I'm counting on it. Karen may have escaped arrest, but her downfall, it was coming, and Hank was gonna make damn sure she never held power again. Karen Whitmore had spent years treating the Maple Creek HOA like her own personal empire, issuing fines, controlling people's lives, and forcing her obsessive vision of order onto the neighborhood. Now, she was losing her grip. Hank had seen it 100 times before. Men in command who thought they were untouchable, right up until the moment they weren't. Karen was unraveling fast, and her latest stunt, trespassing onto his land, getting caught by the sheriff, and nearly facing charges, had only made things worse. But Hank knew one thing for certain. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. And Karen was about to make her biggest mistake yet. The escalation. It started the very next morning. Hank woke up early, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and stepped outside onto his porch, only to find a crowd of people gathered near his fence. At first, he thought it was a neighborhood meeting, or maybe some nosy folks checking out his land after the sheriff's visit. Then he saw the sign, a massive white banner, nailed onto a post near his fence line, with big bold letters. Save Maple Creek. Stop the farm expansion. Hank sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Oh, for crying out loud. Karen had gone full scorched earth. She had organized a protest. Hank grabbed his coffee and made his way over, watching as Karen, standing on a small wooden platform she had dragged in, waved her clipboard like a war banner. We cannot allow this to happen, she shouted. If we let Hank Lawson destroy our beautiful neighborhood with his farm nonsense, then what's next? Goats in our front yards? Tractors on our streets? Property values will plummet. A few of the gathered neighbors nodded and murmured. Others looked uncomfortable, like they had been dragged into something they weren't sure about. Hank didn't say a word. He just waited. Karen was too far gone to realize she had already lost. I have officially filed a petition with the county, she continued, her voice full of self-importance. We are demanding that Hank's agricultural zoning be reviewed and revoked. His property must be brought into compliance with the rest of the community. Hank smirked. That was a big mistake. The counterattack. He finally stepped forward, sipping his coffee as he approached the crowd. Karen spotted him and went rigid. "Hank," she called, plastering on a fake smile. "Glad you could join us. We were just discussing the negative impact our expansion is having on our community." Hank took another sip. "That's so." Karen nodded eagerly. "I assume you'll be cooperating with the petition." Hank chuckled. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folder. "Funny thing," he said, flipping it open. "I had a little chat with the county zoning office after your stunt last night." Karen's smile twitched. And as it turns out, Hank held up the first document, an official county stamp at the top. "They took a look at my land records." Karen's eyes narrowed. Hank held up the second document. "They also reviewed your complaint." Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. "And they were so interested," Hank continued, "that they decided to audit the HOA's legal authority." Karen's face drained of color. Hank smiled. "And guess what they found?" He handed the paper to a random neighbor in the crowd. The man read it aloud. "The Maple Creek HOA does not have jurisdiction over agricultural properties and has no legal standing to challenge zoning protections." "Yes." Karen shook her head violently. This is a mistake." Hank cut her off. "Oh, it gets better." He pulled out one last paper. "This," he said, "is a copy of the counter-complaint I filed this morning." Karen froze. The neighbor kept reading. "The Maple Creek HOA and its acting president, Karen Whitmore, are accused of knowingly filing false reports, harassing a private property owner, and attempting to enforce regulations outside of their legal boundaries." Dead silence. Then, the first neighbor laughed. A second one snorted. And just like that, the tide turned. Someone muttered, "She tried to fine me for my porch furniture last year." Another man whispered, "She made me repaint my mailbox twice." Karen's little crowd? It wasn't her crowd anymore. It was turning on her. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice cracking. This is my community." Hank chuckled. "No, Karen," he said, tilting his hat back. "It's our community." The final straw. Karen lost it. Right there, in front of half the neighborhood. She ripped the sign down, threw her clipboard onto the ground, and pointed a shaking finger at Hank. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "I am not done with you." Hank's smile didn't waver. But before he could respond, a new voice rang out. "Actually, Karen," Lisa Caldwell, the HOA's treasurer, stepped forward, arms crossed. "You are." Karen whipped around. "Excuse me?" Lisa held up her own document, a petition for leadership removal. "This community has had enough of your power trips. Enough of your fake authority. Enough of your bullying." Lisa gestured to the other neighbors. "I think we should vote on whether or not you stay president." The crowd erupted in agreement. Karen looked around, realizing, finally, she had lost. "No," she screamed. "You can't do this to me." But they could. And they did. By the time the votes were cast later that week, Karen was out. Disgraced. Humiliated. Powerless. And Hank? He enjoyed his fully protected land, his fence exactly where it should be, and a newly HOA-free life. Karen Whitmore had spent years building herself up as the absolute ruler of Maple Creek. She had controlled everything, the lawns, the fences, the mailboxes, even the color of people's front doors, with a vice grip so tight that the entire neighborhood had simply learned to comply rather than deal with her wrath. But Hank had done something no one else had dared to do. He had stood up to her. And now, she was falling apart. The HOA vote had sealed her fate. The moment the community formally removed her from her position, she had lost the one thing she cared about more than anything, her power. Hank figured that would be the end of it. But people like Karen don't just walk away. They implode. And in her final act of desperation, she made one last attempt to take him down. The final attempt at revenge. It started 2 days after she was officially removed from the HOA board. Hank had been relaxing for the first time in weeks, finally enjoying his land without having to deal with Karen's nonsense. He was sitting on his porch, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, watching the morning fog lift off the fields, when he heard it. A deep, guttural, ear-piercing screech. Not from an animal. From Karen. He looked up just in time to see her barreling down the road in her white SUV, tires kicking up dirt like she was reenacting a car chase. Hank sighed heavily. He should have known she wouldn't go quietly. She skidded to a stop right outside his property, threw the car into park, and stormed out like an absolute lunatic. Hank took another sip of coffee, watching her rage march toward his fence line. He let her fume for a moment before finally speaking. "Morning, Karen." She practically vibrated with fury. "Don't you morning Karen me," she shrieked, waving a stack of papers in her hand. "You think this is over? You think you can just humiliate me and win?" Hank arched an eyebrow. "Yeah." Karen let out a wordless scream. Hank leaned back in his chair. "Now, Karen, what brings you to my farm this fine morning?" Karen slapped the stack of papers against the fence post so hard that Hank thought she might sprain her wrist. "This," she spat. "I have filed a lawsuit against you." Hank blinked. Then he burst out laughing. Karen's face turned an unholy shade of red. "This isn't a joke, you backwoods redneck. I am suing you for damaging my reputation and destroying property values." Hank wiped a tear from his eye. "Oh, Karen," he chuckled. "This is the most pathetic thing you've done yet." Her nostrils flared. "I have a case. You have no idea what you're up against." Hank sighed, setting his coffee down. "Karen," he said, rubbing his temple, "I just want to make sure I understand this correctly." He pointed at the papers. "You're suing me for protecting my land." Karen sneered. "For destroying the community aesthetic." Hank smirked. "For following state zoning laws." Karen ignored that. Hank tilted his head. "And how exactly do you plan on winning this lawsuit?" Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second. And that's when Hank knew. She hadn't actually thought this through. She was grasping at anything, trying to regain even a sliver of control. But Hank was about to bury her case before it even began. The legal slam down. "All right," Hank said, standing up. "Let's take a look at this lawsuit of yours." Karen thrust the papers toward him. Hank took them, casually flipping through the pages. Then he grinned. "Oh, Karen," he said, shaking his head. "You really didn't think this through, did you?" Karen bristled. "What?" Hank turned the first page toward her, tapping a section with his finger. "This right here," he said. "This is a civil lawsuit filed under HOA enforcement." Karen smirked. "That's right. And I have every legal right." Hank cut her off. "But Karen," he said, his voice mockingly gentle, "you're no longer part of the HOA." Karen's smirk dropped. Hank grinned. "Which means you have no legal authority to file this under HOA enforcement." Karen blinked rapidly. Oh, but wait." Hank flipped to the next page. "It gets even better." He tapped another section. "This lawsuit demands that I remove my fencing under community property standards," he continued. "But as we have established, my land is agricultural." Karen's eye twitched. "Which means," Hank said, dragging out the words, "that this lawsuit is frivolous, baseless, and what's the legal term?" He smirked. "Dead on arrival." Karen's breath hitched. Hank flipped to the last page, held it up, and smiled. "And here's the best part, Karen," he said. "Since you falsely filed this under an authority you don't have, I can countersue you for harassment and defamation." Karen staggered back. Hank leaned in slightly. "So tell me, Karen," he said, his voice calm, even, and deeply satisfied. "Do you really want to go to court with me?" Karen trembled. Then, without another word, she snatched the papers out of his hands, turned on her heel, and ran back to her car. She sped off so fast that she nearly ran over her own sign. Hank stood there for a moment, watching the last gasps of Karen's reign of terror fade into the distance. Then, he took a slow, satisfied sip of coffee. Thought so. Karen never showed up at his property again. The aftermath. With Karen officially defeated, Maple Creek began to change. The HOA, under new leadership, backed off from their ridiculous enforcement tactics. People stopped living in fear of getting fined for having the wrong shade of window shutters. And Hank lived exactly the way he wanted to. His fence stayed exactly where it was. His farm thrived. And every morning he drank his coffee in peace, knowing that he had done something no one else had ever managed to do. He had beaten Karen Whitmore. And he had won for good. Karen Whitmore had finally been silenced. Hank had watched her burn through every desperate tactic: HOA fines, community outrage, legal threats, only to have every single one backfire spectacularly. Now, she was a ghost. For the first time in years, Maple Creek felt free. No more random citations. No more fines for absurd rules. No more fear of stepping out of line just because a bitter, power-hungry woman wanted control. And Hank finally had what he came here for: peace. The calm after the storm. A week after Karen's final meltdown, Hank woke up early like always, pulled on his boots, and walked outside to check on his land. The morning air was crisp and clean, the way it should be. His cattle were grazing lazily, his chickens were pecking around their pen, and his fence stood exactly where he had built it. Untouched, unchallenged, unmovable. He leaned against a post, took a slow breath, and smiled. It was finally over. That's when he saw Lisa Caldwell, the new HOA president, walking up his driveway with a man he didn't recognize. Hank sighed, setting down his coffee. "Lisa," he greeted, giving her a nod. "Was wondering when you'd show up." Lisa smiled, not a fake Karen smile, but an actual, normal, human one. "Good morning, Hank," she said. Hank eyed the man next to her. Tall, clean-cut, dressed in a crisp suit and a county badge clipped to his belt. Lisa gestured to him. "This is Daniel Harris, county zoning officer." Hank's eyebrows lifted. "That's so." The man nodded, stepping forward with a firm handshake. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "I wanted to come by personally and let you know we've completed our full review of your case regarding the previous HOA leadership's overreach." Hank smirked. "And?" Harris smiled. "And I'm here to tell you that your land is fully compliant with all county and state regulations. The HOA had absolutely no authority to issue fines or demand changes to your fencing. Your agricultural rights are protected, and as far as we're concerned," he reached into his bag, pulled out a certified document with an official state seal, and handed it to Hank. "This is a formal notice of exemption from HOA interference." Hank took the paper, scanning it quickly. The final victory. Lisa stepped forward. After Karen's removal, she said, "We did a full review of every HOA violation she issued in the past 5 years. And Hank, we found a lot of them were bogus." Hank chuckled. "That doesn't surprise me." Lisa sighed. "We've refunded fines where we could, reversed citations, and we had to make a choice." Hank raised an eyebrow. "What kind of choice?" Lisa exhaled. "To disband the HOA." Silence. Hank blinked. Then he grinned. "Well, I'll be damned." Lisa nodded. "The damage Karen did was too deep to fix. No one trusts the HOA anymore, and honestly, we don't blame them." Hank leaned back against his fence, stunned but pleased. "So that's it then," he said. "No more HOA?" Lisa smiled. "No more HOA." Hank let out a slow whistle. "Well," he said, looking out over his land, "I didn't think I'd be the guy to take one down, but I can't say I'm upset about it." Lisa laughed. "Honestly, I don't think anyone else could have done it." Harris shook Hank's hand again. "Congratulations, Mr. Lawson. Your land is yours, permanently." Hank nodded. Then, he did something he hadn't done since moving to Maple Creek. He relaxed, because it was truly, finally over. The end of an era. Karen disappeared from the neighborhood not long after. Oh, she still lived there, but she had no power, no voice, no influence. She was just another homeowner. And nobody cared what she had to say anymore. One afternoon, Hank was loading up his truck when he spotted her across the street, struggling to carry a heavy box inside her house. She saw him. For a brief moment, she looked like she was about to say something. Then, she just looked away. Hank smirked. A new chapter. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood breathed easy again. People painted their doors whatever color they wanted. Fences went up, gardens expanded, kids played in the streets without fear of Karen's clipboard. And Hank got exactly what he wanted. A quiet, peaceful life on his land, with nobody telling him how to live. Every morning, he stepped out onto his porch, looked over his unchallenged, legally protected farm, and took a long, satisfying sip of coffee. He had won. And nothing, not even Karen Whitmore, could ever take that away from him. Then,